Our next question, Jim, sent in to CornyDriveThru at gmail.com from Allie in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. This is one of those questions we talk about that's been sent in many times. According to the message here, this is the 10th time that Allie has sent this email in, so we'll give this a chance.
Damn your eyes, Brian Last. You should have got to this before now.
Well, let's see. Maybe there's a reason why it hasn't been on the air. We never know until we read it, so here's Allie's question. First off, I want to thank you for introducing me to old school wrestling, being that my oldest memories only went back to Survivor Series 1997. This question is with regards to whether you agree with my list of the Mount Rushmore for both WWE as well as the NWA. I made this list mainly based on the drawing power, impact on the business, as well as consistency as a top performer in the industry. For me, the Mount Rushmore for WWE consists of Hulk Hogan, Steve Austin, The Rock, and John Cena. Further, the Mount Rushmore for the NWA would consist of Ric Flair, Dusty Rhodes, Terry Funk, and Sting. Also, given that I've listened to over 10 plus hours of your content, I wanted you to explain to the younger fans why Terry Funk was important to the wrestling business and why you have always talked so highly of him. Thank you to Brian for reading this message.
Goddamn, what am I going to do, an hour and a half now just to scratch the surface on Funk, for heaven's sake? I think we've covered that. Not only Terry being a premier worker and being able to progress and change and do different things, from being a kid babyface in West Texas to being a sort of a heel, but still a kind of a technical heel NWA champion, to being a fucking crazy fucking heel with Flair 10 years later, to being middle-aged and crazy in Smoky Mountain Wrestling and ECW, his older brother being a fucking great world champion, his father being one of the most influential people in pro wrestling history, etc., etc. But the whole Mount Rushmore thing it isn't like putting a hat on a hat. It's like the stadium that needs a match rather than the match that needs a stadium. Because you're drawing the analogy to Mount Rushmore, that means you got 4 people to work with. And if you only have 4 people to work with in not only just all of professional wrestling history or even a company, you can't do it. Because the WWF Mount Rushmore there just illustrated where was fucking Bruno. Because without Bruno, you wouldn't have had the rest of them. And he had more longevity. Of course, Hogan's been around longer now, but not steady and definitely not always popular. So then who do you leave off, Cena or The Rock? Or would it be because Austin instigated bigger business even though The Rock became a bigger movie star? It just doesn't work. It's a false analogy. With the NWA analogy, the NWA was so many different territories and different companies, but if you just want to go on NWA champions, then who was on that list?
The list was Ric Flair, Dusty Rhodes, Terry Funk, and Sting.
Help me, Lord Elizabeth, I'm coming.
Well, we could take Sting off that list right away.
Yeah, and it's no disrespect to Sting, but if you ask Sting, do you deserve to be one of the 4 biggest names in the history of the NWA, he'd ask you if you were on fucking acid.
Forget about that. What if you have a conversation with Lou Thez and he's expecting to be on there?
Well, yeah.
Sorry, Lou, we had to get Sting on here.
We had to get Sting on, Lou. Maybe next time. And then, in all honesty, does a Mount Rushmore of the NWA, which existed as an organization from 1948 to 1988, would that not have Lou Thez and Buddy Rogers in your first 2 spots? I think Flair, there's a case. Who would the other one be?
I think Thez is a given. I think Flair is a given. Even Buddy Rogers, I don't know. I mean, he was champion for a couple of years. They were tumultuous years amongst the NWA promoters.
But he was the biggest box office attraction in the business in both of those years.
Would Jack Briscoe make a list like that? Dory Funk Jr. had a pretty good run with the title. If you had to pick 4 NWA champions to best represent the era of the NWA.
Between 48 and 88.
Between 48 and 88. I think Lou Thesz, without question. Ric Flair, I think just because of the longevity. It's 1988, but I mean, still, it's from 81 to 88. It's what do you put in between that? And I think the top candidates would probably be, well, you got to think of Harley, actually.
Yeah.
Harley.
And then also Harley was not only the NWA champion all those times and carried the belt all around the world, but also he was a part NWA territory owner. He was a booker. He was influential behind the scenes. I don't know that you put Terry before you put Briscoe or Dory, because Terry, even though his matches were more fun and generally more exciting, he was not as big a success as either his brother Dory or Briscoe as at the gate as champion, and didn't last as long.
Dusty Rhodes, I wouldn't personally put on an NWA Mount Rushmore. I think if you had a Florida wrestling Mount Rushmore, he's maybe the first guy you put up on there.
If you had a Crockett Mount Rushmore, he might very well be on there, because he ushered in that final huge era that was even bigger than the George Scott, Johnny Valentine, Wahoo era. Flair.
I don't know, though. If you had a Crockett Promotions Mount Rushmore.
See, now we're just changing all the rules, folks.
And by the way, with the NWA
wild card.
Okay, Charlie. With the NWA one, not a wrestler, but Sam Mushnick probably in some way should be up on there. But if we're going to Crockett Promotions.
Well, but then in that case, then Benjamin Franklin isn't on Mount Rushmore, though.
That's true. Teddy Roosevelt snuck in. But
he knew the sculptor.
Crockett Promotions. You got to think once again Flair.
Yep.
Now we're going back away. I mean, it was a tag team territory. That's what makes it a little difficult. It wasn't always single stars.
Then do you go with the biggest box office attractions in the history of the Carolinas as your candidates?
Would Weaver and Becker be on a Crockett Promotions Mount Rushmore?
Very possibly.
If they counted as one slot, let's say.
Very possibly, because the thing is, when you have either Weaver and Becker, or you have Rip Hawk and Swede Hansen, or any of the tag teams in the George and Sandy Scott in the 50s and 60s, when they were running smaller buildings, but almost all the major towns were weekly. And then you have to think, okay, to this tag team or this top guy, he didn't draw these huge crowds like Flair did in or some of the guys did in the 70s, and especially in the 80s, where there were 20,000 people at the stadium or whatever, but they would draw 5,000 people in Greenville, South Carolina, every week for weeks on end on those hot programs, weeks and weeks. And you would end up, Greenville, South Carolina was a town that sold some years 150 or 200,000 or more wrestling tickets to live events. So those guys that were top guys, top teams for so long, repeated programs over years, may have drawn more people in the long run than the fucking guys in the 80s that were doing these sellouts in the big buildings, because it was a different time and a different way of doing business.
Now, Dusty Rhodes is 1984 to 1988 with sporadic guest appearances before then.
Yes.
I don't know if I would put Dusty on there before I'd put Wahoo or Steamboat.
Yeah, and Valentine.
Valentine, because of the
John,
impact.
Not Greg. Yeah. And then, like you said, Johnny Weaver, to the fans in the Carolinas in the 1960s and even early 70s, as ludicrous as it looks now with modern eyes, Johnny Weaver was the most popular young white meat babyface in the fucking wrestling business to those people. They didn't know anybody else. And Johnny could work. He was not a real handsome man, but he had that likability, and he was over with girls and grandmothers, and the guys liked him too. but very unlikely looking physique. Could, like I said, could work his ass off. Wasn't a great fucking interview.
Big ears.
But yeah, it like open doors of a taxi cab. But he stayed in that territory for by the time that he finished as a town promoter and Crockett sold out, he'd been there for 30 years. And every wrestling fan, and there were a lot of wrestling fans to Carolinas at every big and small town, everybody knew who Johnny Weaver was because he had been on every major local television station for fucking 30 years. And then after retiring, he was an announcer. So it's hard to visualize now because everybody thinks, national people. You can see everything now. But nobody outside the Carolinas. Every once in a while, he'd go to Georgia. He might drop down to Florida just to get him out of the territory so he could come back in or whatever. But he never really moved. And he was there for so long. To people outside, the wrestling fans outside the Carolinas, they may have never seen him before. And maybe you'd see his picture in a magazine every now and then. But people in North and South Carolina and Virginia, he was one of the biggest stars in wrestling, and they couldn't understand. If Dory Funk Jr. came into the territory, one of the guys he defended the title against was Johnny Weaver, and people thought that Weaver might win it.
He was such a big star, they let him be a commentator in the 80s.
Yes, he was like, here, longtime wrestling legend Johnny Weaver here now to lend his color commentary. And he was running towns and being a local promoter and working in the office because he had so much experience. And I wish I knew what happened to his finish book. He kept a finish book where he wrote down finishes, not just like every night like I did with my date book. He would just write down the different finishes that they'd come up with. Just one after another, after another, after another. So if you went to him and said a tag team finish, well, let's see it. He'd flip his book. But he knew. And then after Crockett sold out, TBS wasn't going to pick him up. They didn't get it. And they weren't going to run the Carolina towns like they had before. Because not only every wrestling fan, but every high school football coach, every local volunteer fire department chief in the Carolinas knew Johnny Weaver. And they would trust him to bring a wrestling show to town, and they'd do the fundraisers. So since he knew everybody in the Carolinas, he got a job at the sheriff's department, and he would transport prisoners all over the state and all over the North and South Carolina. And they would recognize him, and they wouldn't fuck up because Johnny Weaver was in charge of them, right? They're like, shit, we don't want to have him put the sleeper on us. And he knew the shortest way to every backwoods, backwater town in North and South Carolina. And that's what he did for the last, 10 or 15 years of his life, I guess.
Okay, well, back to the NWA Mount Rushmore.
Oh, fuck it. Fuck the Mount Rushmore.
No, who would you pick? You have to make 4 picks. Jim Cornette's 4 people for the NWA Mount Rushmore. All right,
in the NWA itself, I think, honestly, Lou Thez, yes. Ric Flair, yes. I think Buddy Rogers goes in because of the fact that he not only was the top box office attraction the 2 years he held the belt, but he was the instigation. He was so valuable. He was the instigation toward the Northeast actually splitting completely from the Alliance and doing their own thing, even though their timing was rotten because of his fucking heart trouble. He never got to capitalize on it. After that,
although, heart issues notwithstanding, Georgie and Macropolis heard Buddy conspiring to steal the territory from Vince Sr. Isn't that the story?
Well, yes, but it's not. He was probably going to steal the territory because he knew his heart was bad. He couldn't fucking work anymore.
Oh yeah,
that was his.
That way. Yeah.
That was his next scam, right? Because he's mid-40s, the biggest star in the business, has been or neck and neck with Thez and Rocca for fucking the previous 10 or 12 years. And he finds out he had to be the first one to know. There had to be some heart issue because you wouldn't just quit and not wrestle again. We've talked about this. So he probably figured he had maneuvered himself into position where even though the NWA had gotten their belt back, Vince Sr. was ready to go with him as the champion And as we've discovered, just not say anything, let the people draw their own conclusions on whether it was the NWA title or not. And then, so now Vince has Bruno as a backup, but what was fucking Buddy's backup? Go quietly, like fucking we hope Trump will, or figure out a way to steal the fucking thing. So you got to think that, you know, because everybody said Rogers was the ultimate worker. I bet you there's something that he probably started thinking of that plan about the day he left his doctor's office.
Okay, so that's 3. Fez, Flair, Rogers. Who's your 4th?
I almost think it has to be Harley, with all respect to Jack Briscoe. The most dominant other champion of that 40-year period.
I mean, it's easy to forget Briscoe only had a 2-year run with the.
No. It was 3.5.
Was it 3.5? Okay.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, mark it down in your little black books, wherever you keep it. I got Brian. Terry's was only 16 months or whatever. Or 13 or 14 months. Briscoe won. No, goddamn it was 2.5 because Briscoe won in 73.
He won in 73. I was right.
Yo, wait a minute.
Mark it down in your books, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, shut up. Who would say a thing like that? Dory had it for 3.5. Briscoe had it for 2.5. From 73, July 73 to fucking December of 75.
If he had won it when he was originally supposed to win it, then you would have had a better.
We would have had 3 years. All right.